Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. On the 1st of February this year, Myanmar's military, also called the Tatmadaw, staged a coup in the country, declaring a state of emergency and taking over the reins of the government of Myanmar for a period of 1 year. Aung San Suu-Kyi, Myanmar's state councillor, was arrested along with the country's president. Suu Kyi has been charged with treason and is currently held under detention. Facebook and WhatsApp have both been banned. State media, MRTV, is unable to broadcast and mobile internet is disrupted. In a rare consensus, the United Nations Security Council, of which India is currently a non-permanent member, unanimously called for the immediate release of all those who are detained in Myanmar and stressed the need to uphold democratic institutions and processes, refrain from violence, and fully respect human rights, fundamental freedoms, and rule of law. To discuss this unfolding situation in Myanmar, I have with me Dr. Avinash Paliwal. Dr. Paliwal is the Deputy Director of the SOAS South Asia Institute based in London. His current research is focused on India's foreign policy towards Myanmar since independence. Welcome to the National Security Conversation, Dr. Avinash Paliwal.
I'm very happy to be here. I'm honored and delighted. It's been a long time in the making, Happy. So finally, I'm very glad it's happening.
Thank you. So Avinash, to begin with, could you sort of take us through the recent coup in Myanmar and what, in your opinion, sort of explains why this has happened and the timing of it and all of that?
So what has happened is, since the 2008 transition moment in Myanmar, where there has been a new constitution which was introduced in 2008, there has been demand and desire from the people to have much more participatory kind of politics in the country rather than being under the control of the military junta, which the country has been for a long time. This was triggered at that point in time by what we know as the Saffron Revolution, so-called Saffron Revolution, wherein the monks in particular came out on the streets, and there were long periods of protracted protests, and which were also there was quite a lot of repression against those protests by the government as well. That led to a moment of reckoning, that led to some sort of partial kind of opening up of the country, and the process of that opening up was to bring back the National League of Democracy, represented by one of the most powerful civilian leader in the history of Myanmar, that's Aung San Suu-Kyi. Aung San Suu-Kyi in 2010, the first elections that were scheduled after the introduction of 2008 kind of constitution, refused to actually participate in the 2010 election, leading to the victory of the USDP, which is the Tatmadaw aligned political party. It's a party run by ex-generals, and that was also the principal opposition party in the elections earlier in 2019, right? In 2015, however, she decides to come back, and the NLD runs for elections. She has a huge mandate. She wins the elections, but because of certain constitutional provisions, she's unable to become the president, because if you're married to a foreign citizen, you are not allowed to be. These are caveats which the Tatmadaw kind of ensured to make sure that the powers that be within the remit of Aung San Suu Kyi when she comes to power, which was quite expected in 2015, remains limited. What happens is that the expectation by the Tatmadaw that there would be reduced popularity of Aung San Suu Kyi, that there would be increased kind of electoral salience of the principal opposition, which is aligned to the Tatmadaw, which is the USDP, would create some sort of a balance which will ensure the continuing structural power and even policy salience of the generals in policy making of the country. That seems to have been, that was a miscalculation on part of the Tatmadaw, which led to a moment wherein, especially starting the Rohingya crisis in 2017, there was an increasing civil-military clash that was brewing up in the form of a personality clash as well between the senior general Min Aung Hlaing and state councillor, the position that was created for Aung San Suu Kyi. And there was always this sense that if Aung San Suu Kyi wins this election, which she did, of course, the Tatmadaw claims electoral fraud, even though the Union Election Commission has refused that is the case. there was a concern brewing within the Tatmadaw that if she comes back to power in the next election, having had a successful term, then she would basically be able to rejig the next leadership of the Tatmadaw itself. And that would leave the current leadership quite insecure in some fundamental sense, because there was a lot of pressure against the generals, especially against Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, for what kind of activities they have done in Rakhine State when they were countering the Rohingya, but also generally the larger failure of the peace process. Right? Even though it was chaperoned by Aung San Suu Kyi, the Tatmadaw played a very powerful role in making sure that the ground situation is not conducive enough for the peace process to last. So the coup was really a breaking point between the civ-mil tension, which had come to kind of, which was brewing for the past 2-3 years. And when the calculation, it seems now in retrospect, was made by the senior general that it would be safer for him and his coterie. And it's a very, one point I would like to kind of underline is no coup happens just because one military leader decides that they need to go for a coup. There has to be some degree of consensus within the top officer, top brass of the Tatmadaw, that this is a desirable way forward as we move ahead, because anything other than that would lead to severe costs, not just for the top person, top individual here, that's Min Aung Hlaing, but also a lot of those who are in the queue, basically, to become chiefs after that. So there must be some degree of consensus there, if not entirely, So that calculation must have been done, that it's better to go ahead with the coup right now, make sure that Aung San Suu Kyi does not come back with the even more empowered mandate, and basically fundamentally shifts the balance of political power in Myanmar in civilian hands. That would have been, even though illiberal, let me just underline one quick point here. This was never a liberal experiment. Liberal democracies, as we know the world over, Myanmar was never the case. It was not meant to be the case since 2008. Even the constitution, which was made in 2008, ensures guaranteed seats, which is 25% seats in the parliament for the generals. And you cannot amend the constitution without 75% plus kind of majority favoring an amendment. So you basically need to have the military, the Tatmadaw on board to make any sort of constitutional amendments. And that is exactly what Aung San Suu Kyi's party and she herself were asking just before the elections took place in 2020. And that is something was a final straw of sorts.
So if there were constitutional guarantees for the Myanmar military to continue to be in power, why did they fear that they were perhaps going to lose power to the civilian government under Aung San Suu Kyi in the days ahead?
So there are two reasons for that, Happy, in my view. One reason is the fundamental dislocation of the sources of popularity for the Tatmadaw itself in the country, right? For a long time, especially during the first 5 years of the USDP government under President Thein Sein, which was it was a reformist government. It was not a perfect liberal government, of course, but they were committed, that leadership under Thein Sein was committed to some degree of devolution of control to civilian elected members of the political parties. They were committed to inclusive participatory politics. They were committed to even include external balancing. This is a moment when we see the USDP basically saying no to big Chinese infrastructural projects, especially the Mitson Dam in Kachin State, due to a lot of public opposition to that, due to a lot of popular opposition to that. And that is something that for many generals in the past to assert themselves in the foreign policy domain, especially vis-a-vis China, which is an important issue, has been difficult because they never diversified with other countries, including especially the West, right? So that is a moment we see that there is a fundamental shift happening in terms of how even the Tatmadaw, certain kind of leadership emerging from within the Tatmadaw, wanted to see the country go ahead, right? Aung San Suu Kyi basically, instead of going in direction of a liberal path, which perhaps they expected her to go, right, be a bit of a moderating, inclusive presence, which would be in contrast to the hyper nationalism as espoused by the Tatmadaw, the Burma Buddhist nationalism. She actually began to outbid the Tatmadaw in their own political canvassing. It's essentially, the way she dealt with the Rakhine situation, the way she went ahead, in terms of defending the human rights abuses, defending the genocide, so-called, as it has been called even by, I think, the United Nations, at global institutions, at international platforms, that was something which took everyone by shock and surprise. Even with the peace process, it's not just the situation in Rakhine, the various ethnic and armed insurgencies which are raging across the country. There was a huge hope at the moment she came to power in 2015 among communities which are on the periphery of Myanmar, that she would actually come with some degree of far-sightedness, will make certain compromises, and will accept some of the more legitimate demands. These are not groups which are necessarily fighting for separation, but they do desire increased autonomy in a federal structure. We see absolutely no compromises being made even on that count. So this first issue of dislocating Tatmadaws' kind of political advocacy within the Bamar Buddhist kind of majority in the country, and to kind of capture that imagination in favor of the NLD as being a nationalist party within the country, that instills some degree of caution within the Tatmadaw that this is a leader whose popularity, which we banked on declining, is actually on the rise. That's the first part. The second part is that she actually used her political empowerment to craft independent sort of foreign relations with countries across the region, and in particular with China. Here is a moment where I think this is very important. Having lost the kind of attraction that she held within the West, whether it's the US, whether it's UK and Europe, she needs international allies. And ironically, she saw Xi Jinping in Beijing as being the ally who could actually help her out in the situation which she found herself with the generals. And this, instead of actually making the generals more confident about how she's moving ahead, that increased those political anxiety within the Tatmadaw. And simply because they thought that kind of support that she's receiving from Beijing, she can actually outmaneuver them even on foreign policy issues.
We'll come to China in a more detailed manner.
Sure.
This has not been taken very kindly by the international community. The Americans have really forcefully pushed back the coup leaders in Myanmar. The Western countries are not too happy with it. How is the situation going to in Myanmar going to sort of respond to all these strong responses from the United States and the West? Do you think the junta in Myanmar is not going to be too worried about it, or will they come under some sort of stress and pressure by perhaps the sanctions that would be imposed by the international community? What's your sort of sense of it?
Fundamentally, I don't think they would worry about a change of guard due to external pressure. I don't think that's a concern in the top brass of the Tatmadaw at the moment. Whether they'll be under general pressure, absolutely. Let's not make any, I'm under no illusion for that matter, that the protests that are going on right now in Yangon, across Yangon and across the country, the kind of concerns that have raised by various ethnic armed organizations that this is not in good faith, the coup is not going to be conducive for the health of the peace process, and might have a negative implication for the ceasefires that have already even been in place, and a lot of international pressure and sanctions which are forthcoming. This is something which the generals will definitely not take kindly. But having said that, I think what we often miss when we talk about both the political deck of cards within Myanmar and the international communities, it's much wider and much more diverse than just the West and China. And it's just more than just the NLD and the party of Aung San Suu-Kyi and the Tatmadaw. So let me just unpack a little bit within Myanmar how the situation is going to kind of evolve and how that will kind of relate to the international situation and the kind of, as it is developing. Within the country, I think we need to focus a little bit more on the Sangha itself. The state Sangha of Mahanayaka committee in Naypyidaw. Buddhism is one of the most important socialization forces, religious forces in the country. And the reforms that actually took place in 2008 happened when the internal kind of, there was a revolt from within the Buddhist kind of canons of Myanmar, right? There was a lot of pushback from the monks themselves. And when the monks kind of come out in the streets with the support of the Sangha, that is something which is a very big statement being made. That is what actually kind of has an effect on the rank and file of the Tatmadaw. That is when you change the internal calculus of the generals. These protests, however much stressful, are not going to change the strategic calculus within the country for them. But tomorrow, if the Sangha comes and says, we support these protests and we need to get back to the pre-coup situation and have a relook, I think that is a much more considerable source of pressure on the Tatmadaw than people appreciate often.
Happen?
Sorry?
Is that going to happen? How likely is that going to happen?
It's something that we need to really wait and watch. Now, there are two aspects to the Sangha's position itself. One day before the coup, the Sangha made it clear that they do not want, they basically said they wanted this to be settled through negotiations. They don't want heated arguments. But since the day of the coup, we have heard nothing from the committee, from the Sangha, the Mahanayaka committee, basically. And that silence is it's not being reported as much, but it's actually quite a powerful silence there. I personally don't know what is going on because there's internal politics within the Sangha, right? These committees can be managed, these committees can be manipulated. There are vested interests even in these kind of committees, as we know across the world. These religious groups are not bereft of politicking, but right now it's difficult to point what is going on and whether they will side with the Tatmadaw or whether they will actually go ahead and support the protesters and Aung San Suu Kyi in the days to come. It's a space to watch. But if that happens, I think that would be a considerable move in terms of increasing the stress on General Min Aung Hlaing. And that over a period of time might actually lead to certain officers within the Tatmadaw to kind of push Min Aung Hlaing out if required. There is precedent for that. Let's just go back very briefly to the 1992 moment, and even the Than Shwe moment in 2008. 92 Than Shwe basically ousted Saw in what was considered to be a kind of silent palace coup, wherein the conservative factions within the Tatmadaw thought that Saw would actually let Aung San Suu Kyi come to power based on the election results of 1990, right? They didn't accept that. In 2008, Than Shwe, having known how he came to power in a coup, very carefully curated his exit in form of reforms and without kind of changing the structural balance of power given the constitutional make of the country. So we need to watch that space very carefully. If the monks come out in earnest with support of the Sangha, I think that would be a huge move ahead. That would be a hugely escalatory move within the politics of the country.
Right.
Externally, yes, there is a lot of pressure from the West. Sanctions will be harder sanctions perhaps are forthcoming, but let's not forget the sanctions, especially targeted sanctions against the senior general and the deputy senior general, were already in place for a couple of years. So that is something they must have calculated, that even if that kind of those pressure points kind of escalate a bit more, there are more sanctions forthcoming, that is not fundamentally going to change their strategic calculus. 1, 2, or 3 things have happened. China has actually recalibrated with surprisingly fast, having invested so much in Suu Kyi. To just call this coup a cabinet reshuffle is a very powerful signal from Beijing that they have actually accepted the endurance of Tatmadaw as the most important political body in Myanmar. And that is something which we need to kind of recognize. The Japanese and the Thai, who have a lot of huge aid investments in Myanmar, who in fact the Japanese played a very big role in signing the Arakan Army Tatmadaw deal, in curating that deal, which is one of the most violent ethnic conflict. They are not going to alienate or not disengage with the Tatmadaw because of Western preferences. Same with India.
Let's come to the India question. I mean, where does India stand in all of this? What's at stake for India's strategic interest in the region, considering the situation in Myanmar? I mean, India was not too unhappy with the Myanmar military. In fact, the Myanmar military did help India in sort of calming some of the northeastern insurgencies, for that matter. Now, India being a member of the non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council was part of the resolution which called for continued support of democratic transition in Myanmar. And if you read the Ministry of External Affairs statement, it also is definitely in favor of restoring democracy in Myanmar. So what is at stake for India in Myanmar in the days, months and years ahead?
So let me just first very quickly unpack the interests that we have, that India has in the country, right? It's very important for India to focus on Myanmar to ensure the kind of connectivity that it seeks for the economic development of Northeast to Southeast Asia. So Myanmar, the on-land routes become very important, even though maritime connectivity takes the bulk of that kind of economic transactions as of now. So connectivity is one. Second is counterbalancing Chinese presence in that region. In that country especially. So that is a strategic interest, especially in the light of the situation that we have in Ladakh right now and in Arunachal, given the border standoff that is going on with China. Having a government on side or largely on side in Myanmar is critical. If for God forbid there's a flare up at the Tri-Junction at Walong, then we need to have some kind of understanding with Myanmar as to how to deal with that situation, just like we did with Bhutan and tried to manage it with Nepal, right? So that's the second concern. And the third is, of course, the various kind of insurgencies in Northeast, which have some degree of organic connection or connectivity through Myanmar with China historically, but also having some sort of kind of shelter and support with various kind of ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar itself. So these are the three very important aspects in terms of India's interest in Myanmar to manage them, right, on an ongoing basis. As we move forward, I think India has to strike a very fine balance here in terms of its, how it positions itself given the global responses and the multiplicity of response that is coming on the coup. Instinctively, I don't think anyone in India, definitely not the Ministry of External Affairs, would be happy with this coup. The process of democratization, however illiberal it might have been, it did bring certain degree of stability to the country, and that is very important. Not having an erratic general running the country, it's not easy to deal with the Tatmadaw when they're in power. That's very clear, even though...
You seem to suggest in one of your recent tweets, and I'll read this out, India will be equally concerned about a coup as it is difficult to ascertain what happens next, but ironically, will be less concerned in a geopolitical sense. This is simply because it invested a lot in the Tatmadaw and has had a complicated relationship with Aung San Suu-Kyi at best. So you seem to say that India is probably not going to lose out much because of this power transition, as it were. Is that what you're getting at?
I'm getting at, my point here is that having Tatmadaw running the country is something that is not going to reduce India's trajectory of deepening of engagement with Myanmar without putting any value judgment to that relationship.
Right.
In terms of the comfort that Tatmadaw has with India today, that is not a situation that, we are not looking at 1988 to 91, 93 period. There is much more confidence, and Tatmadaw has already supported India in terms of countering insurgencies, in terms of developing connectivity, in terms of, even countering Chinese influence in the country, So that is something that, in that geopolitical sense, I don't think India has much to worry. The problem is with the second order effect of a coup. When a coup happens, it's not as much, for India at least, the statements notwithstanding, UN resolution notwithstanding, the concern is not having good relationship with the general. The concern is the situation on the ground itself. What if tomorrow the insurgencies, which have been, very sporadic and low intensity till now, actually become more intense? What if the fighting picks up? What if the protests in Yangon or elsewhere in the country take a violent turn? None of that bodes well for any country in the region. That basically, even if you have a friendly relationship with the Tatmadaw, it hinders your connectivity prospects. It makes the country much less attractive, an investment joint. It makes the country much more difficult to engage with, even if you have friendly relationship with it, simply because the ground conditions are not conducive for that kind of connectivity. And I think that is something which is much more pressing a concern right now, even though there is a unilateral ceasefire which has been imposed by the Tatmadaw till the end of this month. It is unlikely that every ethnic armed organization will take to it very kindly. And whenever we see the next iteration of negotiations happening, whether it's with the Kachins, whether it's with the Shan, the Arakanese, Karen, there would be a push by the Tatmadaw to set the terms, and that would be a military negotiation, not a diplomatic one.
Avinash, does this pose a interest versus norms dilemma for New Delhi? I mean, until now, Delhi did not really have to make a choice of that kind, given the fact that there was a dual power center in Myanmar. But now that that is not the case, and the West has come down very heavily against the junta in Myanmar, will India be forced to make a choice between the normative considerations on the one hand and national interest on the other hand? What's your sort of sense?
Abhi, let me kind of start with saying I personally don't see the kind of separation between the two in as neat a terms as perhaps your question suggests.
Mhm.
Right? Norms and interests are deeply tied together.
Mhm.
Uh, Historically, of course, India would prefer a more inclusive polity in most of its neighborhood, right? Because given the kind of social cleavages, whether it's in Nepal, whether it's in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, everywhere, India would prefer these countries to actually work in an inclusive fashion, regardless of their relationship with liberal democracy. And
Mhm.
democracy is perfect; it works well. But if it doesn't, I don't think New Delhi today, or at least for a long time, perhaps barring the Rajiv Gandhi period, is ideologically committed to pushing the democratic kind of agenda in its neighborhood. So I think, in terms of, as far as that debate goes, I think there has been a continuity of kind of privileging India's national interests, perhaps even security interests, as against the norms or the principles of liberal democracy, even if those aspects are preferred. So I think there's much less, and especially in 2021, I think India would be less under pressure from the West as to how it deals with its own neighborhood than perhaps it was when it was much weaker in the late 80s and early 90s and needed the Western support for its own domestic purposes and restructuring its own economy, right? So there is much less pressure on New Delhi. Yes, it would, I mean, my point here is that the statement that has come out of the MEA, it reflects its own kind of preference that it does not like the coup, but will continue doing and continue engaging with the Tatmadaw. I don't think it's really as much about which direction the West is going, and we need to make a statement which sounds strong because the West needs to be
What,
kept
what
on board.
what would be your policy recommendation for New Delhi? I mean, having you've been studying Myanmar for such a long time, and you seem to make a very very interesting argument that there needn't be a contradiction between norms and interests. So, given coming from that perspective, what would be your policy recommendation for New Delhi, as it were?
I think if I were telling New Delhi what to do, perhaps my main thrust here would be that, look, you need to impress upon the Tatmadaw the need to allow participatory politics in a genuine sense.
Mhm.
Whether you call it democracy, whether you call it, whether it's how you do it is something that is worth debating. But there are legitimate concerns both within the Bamar kind of Bamar Buddhist ethnic majority in the country, as well as in the ethnic minorities, which need to be appreciated. It is actually in their interest, in their national interest, to actually deal with and cater towards some of the very legitimate demands which are being made by the people. And having a civilian government actually does not undermine the strategic kind of, the value or the potential of the Tatmadaw itself. I think that is something, that's a message that has to be continuously impressed upon the military in Myanmar by New Delhi, that just because Aung San Suu Kyi won an election and would have come back to power does not mean that people value Tatmadaw less. In fact, there would have been much more appreciation and respect in many ways for the military if they would have actually let this process pan out to its logical end. I think that is a conversation, and for that, you need engagement. For that, you cannot disengage and put sanctions and then expect them to change their behavior. That's something that's, when you push a politicized military to the wall, the only reaction they know is to lash out.
Right.
And that,
That's the issue. I mean, what kind of engagement could potentially New Delhi potentially have with the military generals in Myanmar? That potentially be under the international sanctions in the months to come. Now, this sort of takes me to the China question in some ways, because China is clearly not going to respect. At least that's my analysis. The international sanctions against the generals in Myanmar, which would potentially mean that the generals in Myanmar probably do not have any other option but to get close to Beijing. And if that happens, what kind of engagement should India carry out towards the generals in Myanmar?
So you're absolutely right, Happy, that given the kind of isolation, at least in the West, that Myanmar will face from now on and the pressure that they'll receive, there would be a very natural kind of pivot or re-pivot towards China. I think we would see in the coming weeks or months a renegotiation or a recalibration around the CMEC, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor projects, which is something which is very important for Beijing right now, right? The connectivity ideas. And we also need to appreciate the fact that the Chinese are involved with almost every stakeholder on the ground. They don't just deal with the generals. They invested a lot in Aung San Suu-Kyi. They invest in arguably every ethnic armed outfit on the ground in the country. And Myanmar, I mean, a lot of basic daily items come from China in Myanmar's market, especially in the north, but not just. So I think they have a lot more presence on the ground, even sometimes a lot of visible, but also a lot of invisible presence, which gives them a lot more options to exercise when they're dealing with it. And so strategically, China's heft will increase. That's for sure. I think what more than the West we need to focus on is how countries like Japan position themselves, because that's one of the most important players, strategically speaking, which has actually shown the kind of capacities to be able to counterbalance Chinese financial and to some extent even political capital and investments in Myanmar. This is going to be an Asian story. We are putting a lot of focus on the West, the sanctions from the West. I think Myanmar moving forward is going to be largely an Asian story. And
Avinash, could you tell us a little more about the Japanese angle to the whole the Asian story unfolding vis-a-vis Myanmar, as it were?
So there are two aspects to it. The Japanese never really disengaged with the Tatmadaw historically, the way we saw various Western countries, the US, UK, European countries, disengage for a considerable period of time. So that developed a lot of trust. There is a kind of a shared understanding that yes, and I'm going back to the Second World War. I mean, there's a very turbulent history of Japan and Burma, as it was called then. There is a lot more understanding between Myanmar's political elite, and I include the civilian political elite and the military political elite with Tokyo. And there's a lot of huge aid coming in from Japan, whether it's infrastructural support, whether it's just simply giving aid and provisions in parts of the country which actually require that kind of provision. There's a lot of deep chronic poverty across Myanmar, right? And the Japanese are trying to fill that space. And the idea is, not as much as to outcash China, given the kind of easy financial options offered by China, but to really use their financial heft to bring to bear and to have some sort of a resolution to some of the long-standing problems of the country. And one of the cases we saw was the role that the Japanese envoy played, the special envoy played, in reducing the intensity of violence in Rakhine State between the Arakan army and the Tatmadaw just after the election, but the process was going on much before. So that is where you see it's a Japan-China kind of competition, and the Indians are coordinating very closely with the Japanese on that. So when I say the Asian story, I think it's not as much about democracy and the junta or NLD versus the Tatmadaw. It's about making the international players engage with everyone on the ground and use those connections to actually bring some sort of a resolution, to move away from this very kind of monolithic Burma Buddhist nationalist vision of the country, which would continue to alienate substantial minorities and armed minorities, which is not in the interest of anyone.
Right. We haven't spoken about Bangladesh at all. I mean, how do you think this coup is going to impact Myanmar-Bangladesh relations, given the salience of the Rohingya issue? I did see your tweet again, where you say Bangladesh will take this coup the hardest. Can you explain your position on how this is going to impact Bangladesh negatively?
So Bangladesh, the biggest problem that Bangladesh has has faced in the past few years is to basically get Naypyidaw to agree to some sort of a repatriation agreement in practice, not just on paper, of the Rohingya refugees which have kind of moved across the border and have kind of, they are living in camps in Cox's Bazar, are now being transferred to Bhashan Char, the island just off the mainland. The reason why Bangladesh would take it the hardest is simply because if there was any possibility of negotiations on this issue with Aung San Suu Kyi 2.0, right, if she would have come back to power as expected, because there was expectation that there might be a different calculus at play. There's a new administration in the US, the Biden administration, which kind of might take on the mantle of Obama administration, which wanted to engage with Myanmar, which wanted to bring its resources to kind of deepen the make progress on the democratic transition process as we know it. That is unlikely to happen anymore. And that is something which is what Dhaka will take very hard. It took Dhaka a lot of diplomatic heavy lifting to get neighboring countries like China, India to come in, intervene. However, and they realized that both the Chinese and the Indians are actually ineffective in changing the Tatmadaw calculus. They can get this agreement signed, but they cannot convince the Tatmadaw to take the refugees back, to take those Rohingya migrants back. Now, even a slight possibility of that the window is shut on that issue.
So what is the impact on the Rohingya refugees themselves? Post the coup, will the Myanmar armed forces try and sort of create a peace deal with the Rohingyas? Is that likely at all? If not, what's going to be the fate of the Rohingyas?
Highly unlikely. I don't see the Tatmadaw making any serious concessions to the Rohingya.
Where does that leave the Rohingyas?
It's a very difficult situation. I don't see any immediately any salvation point at the moment, really, to be honest. I think unless, Dhaka, is able to convince other neighbors like India, China, Southeast Asian countries to kind of distribute the kind of refugee pressure that it is facing, which none of them have actually accepted. Even Southeast Asian countries, including, for instance, Malaysia, said that, look, if they reach here, then we'll accept them. But these are really big issues. For someone who has been completely dislocated, having no access to resources, living on a day-to-day basis, to reach Malaysia, it's not easy. It's simply, and there's a lot of illegal marketing that is going on human trafficking issues that are going on in that part of the world. So I don't see any serious resolution of this issue, and the fate of the Rohingyas hangs in the balance. I think Bangladesh has created these structures. They are trying to shift them to this island where they've created some facilities. And according to what I've been told, some of the media reports as well, positive media reports at least, they say that the facilities are not that bad. Fair enough. You can perhaps shift some of the people from the camps in Cox's Bazar, shift them to Bhashan Char. But the question continues, it remains, you are not integrating them in your society. You're not giving them livelihoods. And this is still a minority, this is still a sizable population, which is very vulnerable. And that means it's very highly exploitable. You can have any groups, right-wing Islamists, who can actually just use this demographics to complicate the security situation of not just Bangladesh, but the entire South Asia and Southeast Asia, if they really want to. So it's a security concern. It's a time bomb, really, as far as I see.
Right. Here is my last question. What happens to Aung San Suu Kyi now? Is it the end of the road for her? Is it the end of the road for democracy in Myanmar? You pointed out in your earlier answer that Aung San Suu Kyi is a widely popular leader within Myanmar, but internationally her standing has really taken a beating thanks to her position on various issues, including the atrocities committed against the Rohingyas. So without or will this coup make the international community to change their attitude towards her? What are the odds of her sort of returning to the mainstream politics in Myanmar?
I think the international community would definitely want the respect the Tatmadaw to respect the 2008 constitution, which actually it did not, even though it says it did in undertaking the coup. It would want the democratic transition to continue, however illiberal and imperfect it might have been. As far as Aung San Suu Kyi goes, of course, she was a human rights sort of victim for a long time, and then she became known as a human rights abuser, and now she's back to being a human rights victim. How the view about Suu Kyi itself evolves in the international domain, I think perhaps it's going to be very complicated. I don't think there would be any neat any binaries anymore, unlike it was when she was under house arrest before, and as it was when she was in power. But I think internally, at least, the Tatmadaw is unlikely to let her come back, even if elections are held. Managed elections, of course, in the future. They say 1 year, might be longer than 1 year as well. But I do not foresee the Tatmadaw letting her come back, because any next avatar of Aung San Suu Kyi would be even more aggressively poised against the Tatmadaw. Unfortunately, it reminds me of the situation that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto found himself in with Zia-ul Haq in 1977, where the Pakistani military got really jittery about the very strong kind of personality of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, his wide popularity, at least in Punjab and Sindh. That is something which makes politicized militaries deeply uncomfortable. By doing the coup, they've ironically increased Aung San Suu Kyi's popularity in her constituency, not reduced it. So my pessimistic analysis right now is that as far as she's concerned, her political career might not spring back unless there's a huge movement, unless the calculus changes for the Tatmadaw itself. Let's still wait what the Sangha says. Let's still wait where the rank and file feels if this continues for a long time. She might come back, but as of now, the chances look bleak.
In any case, let's hope that she doesn't meet Bhutto's fate.
I really hope so.
That would be fascinating insights. Thank you so much, Avinash, for joining this conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Happy.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.